We welcome everybody to another in the series of the Working Class Movement Libraries talks, Invisible Histories. Today, we're very pleased to welcome Corinne Painter. She's lecturer in German Studies at the University of Leeds, and her topic is Hidden Histories, Revolutionary Women in Munich, 1919. As I always say, the library's events are free. However, we would like to encourage you to support us if you're able to do so. And there's a donate button on our website. Corinne, thanks very much for joining us, and over to you.
Thank you. Let me just share the PowerPoint. Hopefully that's worked again. Good, thank you. I'll just get rid of myself so I'm not looking at my own face while I'm talking to you. Great, thank you. And thank you, it's great to see so many people there, a few familiar faces, but lots of new people who I don't know. So thank you very much for coming along today to listen to this. And obviously one of the good things is that everyone can just, click log in and join from wherever they might be in the world. But one of the bad things is we miss out on a lovely opportunity to go to the Working Class Movement Library itself. And also, recently it's been quite difficult to travel. So I thought what I might talk about today is kind of an almost imaginary walking tour through Munich, as it would have been during the revolution of 1918-1919, through the eyes of these revolutionary women, so that even if we can't travel ourselves, we can mentally travel through to Munich. So first up, we need to talk about what was the revolution. How did it happen? When did it start? What do I mean when I'm talking about this? And the roots of the revolution are really found back from the very beginning of the First World War. So in Germany, in 1914, there was a lot of war enthusiasm, but we also saw large peace demonstrations in many cities. So there was opposition to the war as well. This opposition began to grow very quickly because the Allied economic blockade was very effective. And what that meant was Germany rapidly struggled to have enough food to feed its population. This situation was compounded because Germany had been importing chemicals to use in fertilizers before the First World War, and they were no longer able to do this. In addition to this, 1914 saw a poor harvest. So this situation is only going to get worse as the war continues. Road and rail were prioritized for military use, meaning that the food that was available was not being distributed quickly and efficiently to the cities where it was needed. So very rapidly, we wind up in a situation of protests, demonstrations, and also strikes over their wages as well, happening all across Germany. And people were quick to make the connection between the food situation, the war, and the fact that the government had led them into this situation. So people understood how this came to be. Scenes like this became quite prominent across Germany. So this is from Braunschweig, I believe, in North Germany. Hopefully you can see this on your images. It's a black and white photo. So this shows a food queue. So we can see here lots of women, mostly women, some children, queuing, waiting for food. And what I really love about this photo, and hopefully you can see this on your devices as well, is that it's women from all classes. We've got women in quite sort of fancy fur coats and hats. We've got women, with just sort of more shabby looking coats, women without hats. So there's a woman with just a shawl. So everybody's kind of mixed in together in this queue. And we have to start to wonder, well, what would it have been like to stand here in this queue for hours, waiting and hoping that when you got to the front of the queue, there would be something left for you to buy? And what did people talk about? And I think this image also gives us a bit of a clue to that as well, because if we look on the left-hand side, hopefully you can make this out, there's a police officer in a spiked helmet standing by the front of the queue, which I think is quite interesting as well. Why is he there? What's he doing waiting there? And it gives us a sense perhaps that what these people were talking about was their dissatisfaction. Perhaps this was an opportunity to start to talk about change, how they might do things differently. And we know from 1915 onwards that this situation of queuing did lead to riots. It did lead to shop windows being smashed. There's some great examples from Berlin of butter riots when people rounded up local politicians and held them hostage until they could try and offer some resolution to this situation. So we know that this is a moment when it starts to tip over from people just waiting for food to actual moments of dissent. So Germany at this point is in what I like to think of, or as my one of my colleagues, Veronica Helfert, calls a proto-revolutionary phase. So it's the kind of fermentation phase of the revolution. And what they needed was some inspiration. And we have here in this image, the idea of the Russian Revolution in October 1917. So this photo is actually from earlier. This is from the International Women's Day of 1917, which is also kind of part of the revolutionary phase in Russia, when the women barricaded the factories and refused to allow men to go into work until they could bring about peace and an end to the war. So in October 1917, we have the Russian Revolution, and this was really inspirational for Germany because people had assumed that the Russians were the most downtrodden and most oppressed people in Europe. And if they could rise up and overthrow the Tsar, then why couldn't Germany do the same? So now the revolution is coming. So we have the kind of proto-revolutionary phase of these, food queues, food leading to food riots and protest, with the Russian Revolution giving people hope that this is possible. And then we have the actual spark that ignited the whole thing. And this happened in October 1918. And so on the map here on the left-hand side, I hope you can see this at home. This shows the borders of the German Empire as it was at the beginning of the First World War. And what I'm going to be talking about is right up in the north of Germany. So that's why there's a circle just above Hamburg on the left-hand side image. So the German Navy was stationed just off Wilhelmshaven, which if you look at the map on the right-hand side, that is the kind of lower left circle. There is Wilhelmshaven. So that's where they were. And they were ordered out on a big final push against the Allied forces in October 1918. And the sailors refused to go. They knew that this was going to be a suicide mission, that they hadn't really participated in much of the war up until this point anyway. The war was basically coming to an end sooner or later, and they did not want to have to go and sacrifice themselves in something which would be ultimately pointless. So they refused. They were then sent through the Kaiser Wilhelm Canal to the town of Kiel, which if you look at the map on the right-hand side, that's the upper right circle. It's where Kiel is. So it's on the other side of the kind of pointy bit of Germany there. And the sailors were imprisoned in the town there. And the townspeople of Kiel came out in protest at this horrendous treatment, but they also protested that they wanted an end to the war. They wanted peace, bread, and freedom. The local authorities in Kiel were very quick to react to this, and several people were shot and killed, but the protests continued. And the 5th of November is the key date here, 1918, when the people of Kiel took over the town and declared that this was it, the war was over and they were in charge now. And this spread like wildfire throughout all the towns in Germany. And it took 2 days to go from Kiel, right at the top of Germany, to Munich, down in the south, which is our focus for today. So you can see in the map on the left-hand side just how far that is. And the fact that that's 2 days is phenomenal in a time before kind of high-speed railway or instant communications, right? That they were able to sweep the revolution through this quickly. So it reached Munich on the 7th of November 1918, and it reached Berlin on the 9th of November, which is when the Kaiser abdicated. And then, as we know, on the 11th was when the armistice was agreed. So Munich in 1918 also saw lots of food protests, strikes, peace demonstrations. They had been a bit protected from the worst of the food shortages because Munich is in Bavaria, and Bavaria as a state is quite rural, it's quite an agricultural region. So it had been a bit protected, but by 1918, the food shortages were everywhere and they were affecting Munich as well. Munich had also been really badly affected with inflation. So people were struggling to afford their rent. They were struggling to afford to heat their homes. The people were losing their work. So it was a real sense of struggle at this moment. Munich also had a long history of peace demonstrations going back to actually the Boer War. And lots of women had been involved in these protests for peace throughout this period. And you can read some really great accounts from the Munich police who were very concerned about what these women were up to. They talk about women gathering in town squares and then marching into the center of Munich to demand an end to the war, or protesting for peace. They also talked about female cigarette sellers going door to door and not just selling cigarettes, but also passing pamphlets secretly around as well. So there's a lot of concern in Munich about what exactly was going on. And this photo is from the 7th of November, 1918, when everybody was heading to a big open square in Munich called the Theresienwiese, where they were going to listen to talks and speeches about peace and about a new world that they could build. And what I love about this photo is you can see lots of women in this image as well, showing that they were very keen to learn and to begin to try and create a new world. So who were the revolutionaries? So that's what the revolution was. Who were the revolutionaries? Well, this is a tricky question to answer, and it really depends on who you're talking about and what questions you ask. So we can talk about the revolutionary leadership. We can look at who made speeches where and what they said. But we mostly find men in that group, understandably, because women have long been excluded from politics at this point. But it doesn't necessarily tell us much about the revolution. What did the average person on the street think? Why did it go from Kiel to Munich in 2 days? How was that possible? And the speeches don't really give us that full picture there. We can also talk about the soldiers and the sailors, but again, that doesn't really give us a whole insight because the sailors, they were on the boats, so they didn't have a clear picture of what was happening on the home front. And the same with the soldiers, they were away fighting, so they couldn't really give us the full story about what it was like in Munich at this point. And also, what about other roles? Who else do we need to include to have a revolution? We need people who, organize the food for the revolutionaries. We need people who organize the administration of it, ensuring people get paid, demobilizing the soldiers. Who's doing this? Who's passing the messages? Who's telling people what's happening in different parts of the country and also different parts of the city? So we need to have a really kind of broad definition and a broad understanding of who a revolutionary is in order to be able to understand how and why the revolution happened. Which brings me to my first Munich eyewitness account, which is Hilda Kramer, who's here. And as you can see, she was born in 1900, so she was really young when the revolution happened. But she had been raised in a radical foster family on the outskirts of Munich from 1911 onwards. And when I say radical, her foster mother was arrested several times because she was supposed to be involved in organising the food distribution in their town and in the surrounding villages, but she was quite often involved in trying to organise revolution as well. So she was frequently imprisoned. And this is the environment that Hilda Kramer grew up in. And she wrote in her memoir, she writes, "I was determined to dedicate my life to socialism. That was my calling, and I was prepared to give up everything I had for it, even my life if necessary. It was so simple and clear." So she had a real vision of why she got involved in the revolution, of what she was going to do. And she was already in January 1918 in this kind of proto-revolutionary phase. She was already involved in anti-war activities, and she was arrested for distributing an anti-war pamphlets. She managed to get away scot-free with this, probably because she was so young that the authorities just assumed that she didn't know what she was doing. And that's why they didn't imprison her for a long time as a result of that. But this was not the end of her revolutionary activity. And we have here her description of the 7th of November, 1918. And she writes, "We marched in the twilight through Dachauer Strasse to the train station. And the closer we got to the Mathesebräu, which is a public meeting hall and a Bierkeller, the thicker the crowd grew. The train station and telegram office were occupied by soldiers. My path led through the Turkenstrasse to the barracks, where, as someone explained, some officers had begun a resistance. Below the windows were many broken pieces of furniture and mattresses that the soldiers had thrown out. When I eventually got home, tired and hungry, I was convinced that the first act of the Bavarian Revolution was over. We didn't just have the workers on our side, we also had the soldiers." And what's really great about this depiction is we get a sense of just kind of the mass of people, how many people took to the streets in Munich to participate in this. We can also see that the revolutionaries have taken over the train station and the telegram office, so the means of transportation and communication have been seized for the purposes of the revolution. We can see the soldiers and the officers starting to have kind of a revolutionary sense there. And that I really like the fact that she talks about this as the first act, that the revolution for her is not just something which happened and then it was over and done with. It's something that has phases And this is just the beginning of it for her. And she also identifies the key importance of having both the workers and the soldiers together. And that if you don't have the soldiers, then they can be used against the workers in order to restore some form of law and order. And the other lovely thing about her description is she describes exactly where she went. And you can do this walk today in Munich. So I just pulled this off Google. So you can see in the bottom of this image, the Theresienwiese, so that's where she would have gone to hear the speeches at the beginning, and then where she walks to the train station, the Malteser, which is now a cinema, and then all the way up to Turkenstrasse, which is where the barracks were. And you can see here it takes 46 minutes according to Google, but I expect it probably took her a bit longer while she was having a revolution on the way. And here's just some photos of what these places look like today. So we've got the train station there in Munich, so we can imagine the revolutionary soldiers arriving on the trains there. We've got the barracks there on the right-hand side. This is all that survives of them. It's just the gate of the Turkenstrasse barracks. I think it's an art gallery today, but you can imagine the broken furniture being thrown out by the soldiers there. And then this image at the bottom left is the Theresienwiese, which is the same one I showed you earlier there, a slightly different angle, so you can see that still exists today. So we can imagine walking, as Hilda did, along the streets for the revolution here. The next eyewitnesses I want to bring in are leader Gustave Hyman and Anita Augsburg. They were both women's rights campaigners, and I'm taking them together because they were actually a couple as well. And they were the founders of the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom, the editors of a journal, Die Frau im Staat, and they wrote their memoirs in 1941. So we have here quite similar to Hilda, although obviously they're a lot older, but we have these women who are involved in kind of a long tradition of campaigning and then joining the revolution. So I've got a nice picture of the two of them here. And they wrote, years had passed since German women had been able to hold a gathering like this. Wartime legislation had condemned them to silence, and for a long time our voices had not been heard in public. Now we were free, now we could talk. Rejoicing, the speakers from various parties and perspectives welcomed the end of the war, the bloodless revolution, the young republic, and pledged their constructive, active cooperation. So they saw this moment as really a chance for unity, for people to work together, and to create something new and better from the ashes of the old system. Which brings me then to kind of reflect a little bit on the organizational structure that came in as a result of the revolution. And this was very much modeled on the Russian model. So we have workers and soldiers councils springing up in towns and cities all across Germany. And these were based on elected representatives from different industries. And also the soldiers could contribute as well. And this here is where we see a barrier for a lot of female participation. Women were involved in lots of industries during the First World War, but as the soldiers returned, they were pushed out in favor of returned soldiers. So they quickly lost their place, and if you lost your job, you then couldn't be on the Workers' Council for that. There were also a lot of trade union barriers, so a lot of trade unions didn't allow women to have different kinds of positions, so it was quite difficult for women to get elected to the Workers' and Soldiers' Councils. There were women who were, but they were a much smaller minority. Munich had a women's council and also a council of intellectual workers, and that's where we do find some of the women. So to go to Hyman and Augsburg again, this is how they talk about it. They said, a new life had begun. The oppressive weight of the war years had vanished. We were striding confidently towards the future. At last, women could throw themselves fully into their work. Women's participation was wanted in all areas of politics and society. We called for women's councils, which we had always seen as one of the best ways to raise German women's political consciousness and confidence so they could learn to make their contribution to the new republic. So they're very positive about the Women's Council. They see this as a chance kind of for political education for women, a way that women can talk about issues that are affecting them, and try and then push this into the mainstream council agenda, and as they say, make their contribution to the new republic. So it's a way for women to contribute clearly. It's a bit more complicated than that. The Women's Council was very much a kind of separate entity, and you know, wasn't really integrated in the same way that other councils were, which then leads me on to my next eyewitness of Rachel Strauss. And she was one of the first female doctors in Germany. She was involved in all kinds of women's organizations before, during, and after the First World War. And she joined 2 councils. She was on the Women's Council, and she was also on the Council of Intellectual Workers because she was a doctor. And unlike Hyman and Augsburg, she has a very different interpretation of this. She says, over time, it didn't lead to any proper work. There was a lot of talking, but without a proper workers' program. I can barely recall a resolution with a positive meaning. So she kind of sees this as a lot of people talking and a lot of action happening. And I think it's quite important to reflect on these different experiences of these female revolutionaries, that it then enables us to kind of see the plurality and diversity of voices that were included, but also to see the difficulties that they faced in trying to make change, and that it wasn't always going to be successful. So what happens next? So this leads us into 1919. So in November 1918, so after the sort of revolutionary phase that Hilda Kramer talked about, her first act of the revolution, Kurt Eisner becomes the premier for Bavaria. In February 1919, there are elections in Germany. He loses, but he's then assassinated by an anti-Semite before he's able to resign. We then have a period of chaos and different competing groups trying to take charge until April 1919, when there is a group of anarchists and communists declare Bavaria to be a free Soviet republic. The national government reacts very swiftly to this, and they send government troops, but they also send right-wing paramilitaries known as the Freikorps. That might be a familiar word for some people. And in June 1919, after weeks of brutal fighting, the Soviet leaders are murdered, some of them are arrested and some of them are executed. And this fighting happens right in the heart of Munich. There are some really gruesome eyewitness accounts of shooting happening in some, normally very well-heeled and respectable neighborhoods in Munich. Which brings back Hilda. So she was actually a secretary to the Soviet. And when I say secretary, some people assume that I mean a sort of, someone who's doing a bit of filing and maybe answering the telephone. No, Hilda was actually a secretary in the kind of trade union, left-wing political party sense of the word, in that this is a really key role in organizing the Soviet. She is involved in writing the minutes for meetings. She organizes the agendas, what gets discussed, what doesn't. She writes the motions that people then vote on. She ensures that people adhere to rules and regulations. So it's a very key role that she takes on, despite being quite so young. And she's actually arrested after this, but she's only sentenced to a few weeks in prison. And as I mentioned, some of her comrades are, murdered, some of them are executed by the state, and some of them are sentenced to years in prison. But she is only there for a few weeks. And again, I think this is probably because of her age. Again, I think, being a young woman, it's assumed that she doesn't know what she's doing. So instead of spending time in prison, she's actually extradited from Munich and told that she can't come back. We have to remember, though, this is her second offence. So I think the idea that she didn't know what she was doing is not really credible in this. I think she had a good idea about what she was getting herself into, and her memoirs certainly suggest the same as well. So let's kind of wrap up with thinking and sort of reflecting on these female revolutionaries that we looked at. So I'll start out by giving you a quick summary of what happened to all of them after this. So we'll start with Rachel Strauss on the left there. So she continued working as a doctor, and she also continued with her campaigning for various women's rights issues. She was particularly involved in campaigns around access to healthcare for women. As a Jewish woman, she was obviously facing huge threats in the 1930s. So in 1933, she left and emigrated to Palestine, where she continued to be involved in welfare work and kind of campaigning issues there. To go to Hyman and Augsburg, they, as long-time dedicated campaigners and writers, they continued to write and campaign throughout the 20s, which made them very prominent. And when Hitler came to power, they also were quick to flee because they knew there was going to be a huge target on them. And they both died in exile in Switzerland in the 1940s. And then Hilda Kramer in the middle there. She left Germany let's rewind. So after she was extradited from Munich, she went to Berlin and then went to Moscow, where she helped with building the new state in Russia. She was back and forth between Moscow and Berlin for a bit. She then worked for a trade union in Berlin. And then in 1937, she emigrated to Britain, where she joined the Labour Party. And in 1945, she was involved in writing documents that became part of the NHS Act as well. So that was her story. So I think one of the first things to think about in regards to these women is this idea of success or failure. So it's really easy to dismiss the revolution as a failure and say, well, you know, they didn't achieve everything they wanted to achieve. And then anyway, Hitler came to power, so nothing really matters. But I think if we look at them and their lives, success or failure doesn't make any sense as a framework, because they dedicated so much of their time to these challenges. You know, before the First World War, even, they were trying to improve the world. And then as we see in the case of Hilda Kramer, throughout the First World War, she's, you know, putting a lot on the line there to really try and challenge the world in which she found herself. The revolution was also not the beginning, and nor was it the end for these women. You know, it was their activism started before, and it kept going on beyond it. It also gave them networks and connections that they would never have made otherwise. So it's, you know, it's a bigger story than that. It also gives us new perspectives on how and why the revolution occurred. You know, if we only talk about the sailors, well, we only get a couple of days of anything happening, and we don't really understand how it spread. We also don't understand the full extent of the different roles and, you know, what it was like to be on these councils, which, you know, particularly Rahel Strauss's experience gives us a different perspective perhaps on the revolutionary leadership. So by including these women and including these kinds of stories in our understanding of the revolution, it really gives us a fuller picture of what happened and how it happened, and a little bit more of an insight into Munich at that time. So I think I'm going to stop there. So we've got plenty of time for conversations and discussions. If anyone wants me to go through anything again, please just ask. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, Corinne, very much indeed. On behalf of everybody in their living rooms or wherever, I think it's really interesting, isn't it? Because I said in the chat that we tend to focus on the UK, and we've had talks. We've had Cyril Pearce, who I think is here today, talking about peace activism in the UK. We've had Ralph Darrington talking about labour unrest in the UK during after the First World War. So this gives us a really interesting sort of wider picture. So thank you very much indeed. I'm conscious that one of our regulars said to me, I think before you joined us, it'd be great to have some tips of books to read, further reading about a topic. So I don't know if there's anything that you would recommend.
Oh, good question. I mean, a lot of the primary materials for this are written in German. So if you're a German speaker, feel free to look up these women, and you'll be able to access, you can get the copies of their memoirs off Amazon usually, or other such places. Maybe not Amazon, secondhand bookshops. But yeah, unfortunately they're not available in translation. I can recommend, I'll put it in the chat in a second. So I've written an article about some of these Jewish revolutionaries, so I can put that in the chat as well, and that's in English. So there's that one. I'm trying to think of the sort of general books. What would I recommend? Oh, Belinda Davis. She wrote a great book about everyday life in World War I Berlin, I think is the title, something like that. And that's a great read because she uses these police reports to talk about kind of this sort of proto-revolutionary situation, and, you know, what the police were thinking was happening with these women rioting over butter, and what we can draw, the conclusions we can draw about revolutionary organizing and activity there. So I'm just going to quickly get my article, and I can share that one as well.
Okay, well, while you do that, I will ask our audience whether they have any questions. Would anyone like to wave at me to ask a question? Lois, do you want to unmute yourself?
Okay, yes, I just wanted to comment really, because my husband's my aunt-in-law must have been politicized by what was going on in Germany at that time. As a young woman in Berlin, she became a communist and moved with her husband to Moscow. And it's really interesting for me to hear this background to why one of the reasons she may have, wanted to take that step. I did ask her at one time why she had become a communist, which the rest of her family weren't. And she said it was because of the poverty and the unemployed knocking door to door begging, which is a straightforward response, I think. Yes.
Yeah, thanks, Lois. Yeah, I think that's a more common experience than perhaps we might be aware of otherwise, that witnessing all of this suffering firsthand, and then understanding how the kind of political decisions that have led to that, I think were quite formative for a lot of people.
She paid heavily for doing that because she was in Moscow during the Second World War, and as a German, and also as partly Jewish. She was exiled with her partner at the time and her children to Uzbekistan. But she remained a communist all her life and returned eventually to live in East Germany in the 50s.
Oh, that sounds like some really interesting person there. Thank you.
She's quite well known. She has a Wikipedia entry, Gabriele Stamberger. She was, and she was with different people. Gregor Gork, who was a partner for a while, who was a German revolutionary.
I can feel another talk coming on, Lois.
Oh, right. Well,
leave details.
I'd love to talk about her. She's worth talking about. Yeah.
Pia, you've got your hand up. Do you want to unmute yourself?
Yes. Thank you. You just gave us a little bit of an insight into more everyday women. You didn't talk very much about organisations, and well-known women, but I wondered whether you'd want to say more. I mean, I've heard of Clara Zetkin, Rosa Luxemburg, were all part of the mix that, besides the revolution, I mean, there was a really big communist party in the 20s in Germany, wasn't there? And that involved a lot of women's organisation and working class women. So I just wondered if you want to say something about the relationship of these individuals who were revolutionary women, I take it, to perhaps what we know more about, the more well-known figures or organisations.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. That's a lovely question. Yes, I mean, you mentioned two there, so we can talk about Clara Zetkin and Rosa Luxemburg. I mean, Rosa Luxemburg is just a giant of revolutionary thought. And her words just echo through what these women were writing about, through their memoirs, what they were thinking. I mean, it's fitting her into the narrative of the revolution is actually kind of tricky because, she was in prison in November 1918. She was released as part of the Revolutionary Act, and then she was murdered in January 1919. So it's, trying to fit her what she did into that is kind of a bit trickier. But I mean, I think the legacy of her thinking is phenomenal on all of these women. And Clara Zetkin is another one whose thought was so influential, particularly in the peace movement. So for Hyman and Augsburg, Zetkin's thinking was very much part of how they understood the world around them. You also mentioned the Communist Party in Germany. Yes, it was very big, particularly in the early years of the Weimar Republic. Hilda Kramer was a member, and she was a delegate to the conference in Berlin, I believe, as well. So yeah, we've got a connection there. I mean, the women I like to talk about the kind of everyday experiences of women in this moment, because I think it's useful to remember, we do have a few leading figures like Luxemburg, like Zetkin, who were, prominent, but they're not everyone. And I think it's also important to remember just kind of how many everyday, if we can think about people in those terms, people who weren't towering intellects like Luxembourg, people who were trying to get by as best they could on a day-to-day basis, but who were willing to sacrifice so much for the revolution as well. So that's kind of why I wanted to bring those in. Yes, we can see the connections there to the political parties. Rahel Strauss is an interesting one to reflect on with regards to political parties. She describes herself in her memoir as entirely unpolitical, which I think we can all kind of raise an eyebrow at, because you don't, from my perspective, I would argue you don't join a council if you're not political, if you don't have a political opinion. But I think what she meant was perhaps that she wasn't aligned or affiliated to a particular political party, and that she kind of chose a different path from that. And I think the fact that she's quite so sneering of these particularly men who were involved with political parties suggests that perhaps she's more interested in getting things done rather than philosophizing about the best way of doing something. But thank you for a lovely question.
All right, no pressure on everyone else. You've got to beat that. Has anyone got anything they would like to say? Do wave at me. Elaine, do you want to unmute yourself?
Yeah, kind of following on from that question, I was wondering if there's any sense of the numbers of women who were involved in the councils. And we've seen the pictures of women in the food queues, but I'm not sure about, were women involved in work outside the home in Munich? Were there factories? Is there any sense of women becoming involved in the councils, from workplaces, for example, as well as food queues? It's kind of trying to tap into those experiences of ordinary women.
Great, thanks, Elaine. So nationally, it's estimated that women were about 5% of total council members. So there would have been some councils that didn't have any women on them at all. And I don't know the specific figure for Munich. I think it'd be really interesting to try and find out. Unfortunately, it's difficult sometimes to get the records on this. And quite often when you read some of the council records I've seen, they'll say something like a woman was elected, but they won't tell you who she was. Or they'll just sort of say people were here, and you think, well, is that men or is that men and women? And it's not really clear from that description. You don't always get a full list of names that you can definitely match up. Sometimes they just write things like Mrs. Smith was on the council, and you're like, where is Mrs. Smith? How am I supposed to find her? So it's quite frustrating to really kind of drill down onto who exactly was where. Sometimes the records just didn't survive. We're talking about a time where there's resource shortages, there's paper shortages, so people didn't always write things down, and they haven't necessarily been preserved either. So it is kind of difficult to get a real sense of who exactly was involved where. We also have the problem that families often preserve letters that they received from their soldiers, but they didn't necessarily preserve the letters that they sent. So we don't necessarily get a full picture of what exactly was happening and who was doing what. So it is quite hard to really kind of clarify it. But I mean, I agree, I think it is an important task to try to get this sense of it. Women were entering the workforce in larger and larger numbers at this point. Munich did have some factories, not as many as in other cities, but yes, there were factories there. So you do see women entering the workforce. So there's potential there for women to get involved in workplace councils that way. But very quickly, they were being pushed out of the workplace in favour of the returning soldiers, even during the revolution. So their numbers are declining at this particular point. One nice way of looking at it is to look at the delegates to the Communist Party conference, and you do see a large number of women there, so you can kind of identify a few names. But again, quite often it's just Mrs. Smith, and you can't get much further than that with some of these names sometimes. But I mean, I agree, there's more work to be done to try and identify as many as we can.
Thank you. Thanks, Elaine. Anybody else? You are getting towards your last chance to write. If you haven't got a camera, then you can stick something in the chat or press the hand up sign, as Pia has just done. Pia, yes.
Sorry, just to ask another question. We saw at the in anti-war movements, there's quite a movement of mothers. Like I was thinking of the demonstrations at the beginning of the opposition to the war, the American war in Vietnam. You know, there were really quite massed ranks of women coming, not as women workers, but as mothers of, you know, soldiers or potential soldiers who were going to be recruited into, you know, a death sentence in the war. I wondered if that was part of the movement of more ordinary women and working class women. And also, I mean, at the same time, although there was a pushing out of women in Britain from industrial work, they didn't go back into the massed ranks of servants, domestic servants anymore. They were much more part of the workforce after that, weren't they? And I wondered if the same process was going on in Germany after the, you know, in that immediate revolutionary period and afterwards.
Great, thanks, Pia. Yeah, so to answer your first question about motherhood, yes. So I think there are probably people who are well more versed on the peace movement at this time than I am. But yes, the rhetoric around motherhood was very important to women's involvement in the peace movement. You know, they talked about the fact that, you know, as mothers of soldiers, how could they be expected to bring life into this world only to send it off to be, you know, fight and die somewhere else. So it was a real part of that. I don't have an example from Munich during the revolution of people using that rhetoric. However, in Berlin, Lola Landau, who's another revolutionary woman, she writes in her memoirs of the importance of motherhood, because she gave birth twice during the First World War, and her second son was quite sickly due to the fact that, you know, neither she nor he were getting enough to eat. And as a result of that, that really pushed her into peace activism and joining the revolution. And in her mind, she talks about how the revolution should be women reaching out to each other across borders, mother to mother, to create a peaceful world. And actually, we should create a world where men aren't in charge because they cannot be trusted. And it should be the mothers, you know, as mothers of the nation and mothers of children and mothers of the next generation, that they should be the ones to, you know, bring this new peaceful world. So she really viewed it that way. But I don't have a Munich woman who saw it like that, but there's a Berlin example for you there. And with regards to your second question about women's employment and what happens afterwards, so yes, obviously a lot of women lost their jobs. They did not go back to domestic service. Germany already had a bit of a crisis in domestic service before the First World War, where they didn't have enough young women and girls who wanted to be domestic servants, mainly because the conditions were horrendous, and the pay wasn't great. So they already had a crisis beforehand, and that just then worsened. However, Germany after the First World War had massive hyperinflation and huge economic problems. So there just wasn't a lot of work to go round. There was big unemployment for women at this point, which really continued until about 1927, before the economy started to stabilize. And then we then get, you know, more investment from America and Germany, and the kind of more jobs coming along, and you do see jobs for younger women then. So this is when we start to see the rise of the secretary, in the typist sense of it, or, you know, women working in department stores. But these are much younger women than the women who we would have seen prior to the revolution. So hopefully that's addressed your questions.
Thank you. Thanks, Corinne. And a message in the chat from Helen, who thanks you for a really great talk, and says, to what extent did any of the women you've researched identify explicitly as feminists, as well as socialists, communists, anti-war activists?
Good question. I mean, this one of labels is really tricky. So some of the women, yes, they did talk about being feminists, but feminist at this point in history had a really negative connotation. So a lot of women would expressly say, I'm not a feminist, because they didn't want that label being applied to them and you know, being written off as some kind of hysterical mad woman. So they, expressly denied being feminists as well, despite the fact that today we might look at what they were doing and their politics and say, well, actually, you were. The idea of identifying as socialists, communists, and anti-war activists. That's another interesting one. So Hilda Kramer, yes, she was in the Communist Party, but I don't think she explicitly identified herself as a communist. And she was constantly, if anyone knows the history of politics in the Weimar Republic, the left wing was constantly fracturing into different groups at this point, and you get lots and lots of different left-wing parties. And Hilda Kramer, she's always on the left, but she fits into many different parties, and kind of slides between all the different groups. So although she expressly says that she's a socialist and she's dedicated her life to socialism, she doesn't really say that she's a communist in the same way. And I think these labels are quite difficult for women to identify with in a lot of ways, because either, as in the case of feminist, it's a negative label or being used to attack them, or it's a kind of political ideology label that doesn't necessarily fit them either, that because of their upbringing, because of their understanding of the world, because of their introduction into politics and the way that it happened, they don't necessarily have the same identification as someone who's maybe a man who's, grown up with a political tradition in his household, who's been voting his whole life, whereas for these women, they only got the right to vote in 1918. So it's kind of a different sense for them about how to understand themselves as politics and in a political grouping. And I would say for the Jewish women that I've mentioned, adding a label to yourself on top of that makes your life even harder, right? So, as Jewish women, they're already facing threats from anti-Semites. And taking a public platform, as somebody like Rahel Strauss did, meant that she was going to have to deal with this, and she was going to attract this kind of negative attention. And then putting another label on top of that, would have attracted even more negativity towards her. So I think for a lot of the Jewish women, it was quite hard to really pick something and have that as a strong sense of identity. So I guess that's my answer to that question, that sometimes they did, but it was tricky, and quite often they were very cautious around using different labels.
Thank you. Isn't it great that we have so many expert speakers who are so thorough in their knowledge that they can just answer every question in such a splendid way? It's fantastic. Does anybody else want to ask what might be a final question? Is anybody wanting to wave at me, or have we? Oh yeah, Lois, go on. Right, this could be the last one. Lois, go for it.
Sorry. Yeah, I was referring to the shortage of domestic services in servants in Germany between the wars. My mother-in-law, also from a German bourgeois background, was part of a scheme whereby young single women were sent into respectable households to learn the art of household management. And she was quite quickly withdrawn from that because they found out she wasn't actually completely Aryan. Yeah. But it was a scheme. It was extraordinary to think of now. Yeah, it's like an au pair, I suppose, but not paid. I shouldn't think.
Yeah, we find lots of schemes throughout the 20s and 30s trying to encourage specifically, young girls to go into service. But it really wasn't popular because you could make more money working elsewhere, and also it was 9 to 5. If you work in a shop, it's 9 to 5 Monday to Saturday, and that's it. Whereas if you're a domestic servant, it's whenever the family gets up until whenever the family go to bed, and you have to live with them quite a lot of the time as well.
Yes, this would have been a live-in position. Yes. Well, not a position; it was just a scheme, really.
Yeah, so it was unpopular. We do it within the Jewish community as well. They set up similar schemes to try and encourage young Jewish girls to go into service as well, because they could then maintain an Orthodox home. But again, it wasn't very popular.
Okay, this is our final call. I think we are about to say thank you very much indeed to Corinne for her expertise and enthusiasm in presenting to us. Much appreciated. And next week's talk, Wednesday the 24th of November, 2 p.m, is online only again. And in a change from the talk originally advertised, we're grateful to Kirsty Blair for stepping in with a replacement talk, tying in with our guest exhibition Literature in the Mines, which opens in the library on Friday. And her topic is Freighting of the Pit, Northern Miners as Writers and Readers in the Long 19th Century. This talk has been recorded and will be uploaded to our YouTube channel shortly, and we'll be putting the link on the event webpage. A reminder that our talks are free. However, we would like to encourage you to support the library if you're able to do so. Thank you very much indeed to those of you who do regularly do that. We do appreciate it. And there's a donate button on our website. Thank you again and goodbye. Take care, in solidarity. Very best wishes from all at the Working Class Movement Library.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you,
Thanks for
Corinne.
coming.
Really interesting.